Hi everybody, I'm Zilla Blitz and welcome. Today I'm hiding behind a prototype copy of Song for War Mediterranean Theater. Now this is a 2 to 4 player game designed by Invicta Rex that is a sweeping kind of strategic operational level game of the entire Mediterranean theater in World War II. I'm going to start out with a power review, then I'm going to show some of the gameplay features, and then I'm going to offer up some final impressions on the game, keeping in mind that this is a prototype version and some of the gameplay elements and some of the things that we're going to look at today could be different in that final version. Let's start with our power review. In the last couple months of 2022, I played 2 games in particular that rocketed to my list of my favorite games of the year. Song for War Mediterranean Theater is one of those 2 games. Now, if I had to use 3 words to describe the gameplay, it is sweeping, fun, and creative. First up, sweeping. This is a grand scale game, so you've got the map of the entire Mediterranean theater, but the thing about it that catches you off guard is how fast and fluid the gameplay is. Now there's 2 scenarios, a 6-turn scenario and a 4-turn scenario. You might think, that's not a long, you got 4 turns in a whole scenario? That's 1943 to the end of the war. Things happen so fast, and each turn is really kind of contains a number of mini turns within it. Things happen so fast. In one turn, you can have 4 huge events that go on. So you're expecting this to be kind of a slower, methodical game as you look at the map, and then as you play, you realize, wow, this game just takes off right away, and you're just thrown right into the action. There's no delay, and all of a sudden, you're totally engrossed in what's happening. I want to talk about fun. I feel like at every stage of this game's development, there's been an emphasis made on fun and engaging gameplay. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the side effects of that later, but the point is that when you're playing the game, the uniqueness of the units and the fact that every unit has special abilities and the way the units interact with each other is so thoughtful and so considerate in terms of how it's been developed that you're constantly challenged to kind of come up with ways to execute your plans and to use the uniqueness of your forces and your abilities to its best advantage. Layered on top of that, each of the 4 nationalities has distinguishing characteristics that become evident as you play out. So you've got this kind of fun level of national development to explore as you're playing the game. And the gameplay, again, going back to that fast and fluid, it's engaging and you've got these cool little toys to play with as you're playing with your nation to execute your plans. And that emphasis on fun, I think, really stands out in every moment of the game. This is a game where you explore the creative and you have to change your plans on a dime depending upon what your opponent does. So you might be looking at invading Sicily and then you're like, nope, wait, they've given me an opportunity in Greece, we're shifting. We're going to Greece and we're gonna hit Greece hard. You might say, no, we're gonna shift by Sicily and we're gonna land right on the bottom of Rome. Or as the Germans, you might be saying, okay, where can we retake ground? We're really gonna try to hit out for Alexandria and see if we can slide off into the eastern part of North Africa. So the game The game not only allows you to explore the hypothetical, the game celebrates the hypothetical. That's the right way to say it. Putting all those 3 things together, you've got this fast-moving game that gives you a toy box and a sandbox, a toy box of units and a sandbox of a theater to play in, to execute and kind of explore some creative wargaming around the World War II theater in the Mediterranean. 2 quick clarifications before we take a deeper look at gameplay. I've shown this to people and they've said, oh, it's Axis and Allies in the Mediterranean theater. No, it's not. Absolutely not. It looks like Axis and Allies, but in every area of the game, this is a level or 2 or 3 more complex than Axis and Allies. The units behave more uniquely, the sequence of play is much more in-depth and engaging, and there are mechanics to this game that are layered on top of the gameplay that make it. I'm not sure if Axis and Allies on steroids is anything close to a fair comparison, but there is much more complexity and depth in this game than in Axis and Allies. Nothing against Axis and Allies, this is just a different game, so don't make that mistake. A couple of things that I think are important to understand about the game going in to make sure that this is a game for you is to talk a little bit about who it's not for. If you're looking for a game that is going to faithfully recreate the Mediterranean theater in World War II almost every time you play it, this game isn't for you. This is a game that, again, that leans into that hypothetical, that creative element that you're going to be rewarded for your boldest plans. It's not going to be a game that's going to channel you down the traditional World War II Mediterranean theater experience. Lastly, I want to elaborate on some of the gameplay elements as well, because I mentioned the gameplay's fast, but that's not to mistake that the game is a superficial game at all. There are two scenarios, and the first scenario, the 1942 full 6-turn scenario, takes about 4 to 7 hours to play. So this is a hefty game. By fast, I mean that the pace of the game is fast and things move quickly and there's a lot packed into a condensed amount of time. But you don't want to make the mistake that it's a superficial game. The 4-turn scenario is about a 2 to 4 hour playing experience, so there's a good bit of heft to that scenario as well. However, having said that, I do want to say one last thing about the gameplay, in that I mentioned earlier the gameplay focuses on fun and engagement. And that's the second thing that I think that's important to understand as you're making a decision about whether this is a game for you. Because this is a game, I think, that highlights that fun and engaging gameplay over historical accuracy. So this isn't designed as a simulation of the Mediterranean theater. It's designed as a fun and engaging game of the Mediterranean theater. When you combine that with that kind of encouragement of exploring creative options in the hypothetical, you start to get an overall sense of what type of game this is and what type of game this isn't. With all that said, let's jump in now and take a look at some of the cool features of the game. Before we dig into some of the individual characteristics of the game, I want to talk about just a big picture overview. This is a 2 to 4 player game. The 4 sides are British and US as the Allied forces, Italians and Germans as the Axis forces. If you play it 2-player, 1 player controls the Axis forces and 1 player controls the Allied forces. If you play it 4-player or 3-player, 2 people are controlling each of the Allied side or the Axis side, as the case may be. Now, if you're interested in this as solo, there's only one mechanic that I'll show later, which is the hidden fleet mechanic that would prevent you, would probably be something, when I've tried it, so I've left it out. That's the only thing I think that doesn't really work very elegantly solo. It's a hidden fleet mechanic that you keep secret from your opponents. That's the only thing missing in solo mode though, although there is no solo bot for this. It's pretty easy to play both sides and kind of explore different options with the game. Now, there are 2 scenarios in the game. There is a 1942 scenario, which lasts 6 turns. And again, each turn has a number of mini turns in it. So that's a lot of turns. It's really 6, almost times 6 is like 36. And each one of those bigger turns takes probably about 45 minutes to play, depending on how they go and things like that. So the length of that game, 4 hours to 7 hours, I think is what it's listed as. And then there's a 1943 scenario, which is a 4-turn scenario. And that one takes about 2 to 3, I think is what it's listed. I'd probably say more like 2 to 4 in terms of how it plays out. So those are the 2 options for playing the game. I want to talk about the design a little bit as we pan around and just do an overview of this game at the start of the 1943 scenario. This, of course, it's an area movement game. The Mediterranean is carved up into all these different regions that we can see here. Just spectacular design, though. One of the most gorgeous wargaming maps I've seen. I love the color palette and I love the color of the Mediterranean. Now, I've shown this to people who aren't wargamers and they just stare at it forever, looking at all the different places. And it just kind of evokes this kind of what the potential is of the game that's going to play out. And it just makes you kind of want to reach in and kind of grab stuff and move it around. It has a very war game type of a war room type of feel to it. In the prototype here, these units are all with little decals stuck on them, but in the final version, all these units are going to be silk screened. Now, as we're looking at these are the British units here. We've got an aircraft carrier off the coast of North Africa and some fighters and things like that, but all high quality wood, nice kind of clunky, good little bit of heft and kind of in meat to these units as we're looking at them, but just lots of elegance in the design and the detail on the map. I mean, the depths of the Mediterranean, the units, the cities, the land terrain. It's just got such a spectacular visual appeal to the game. One of the big features of the game to me, it just draws people in. You just want to play it as you're looking at it. Let's talk about victory. Every strategic location in the game has a victory point total. So we can hear Bizerte has a total of 2, Tunis has a total of 4. As we look up here in Italy, Taranto has a total of 4 victory points, and Naples as well has a total of 4. More strategic locations have larger victory point totals, and smaller ones have lesser victory points. And the way you win the game is basically by swinging these victory points. And each one of these, if you have them if you're in your control, you get these little markers that you hold off on the side of the board that tells you that these are the total points that you have. So in the 1943 scenario, for example, the Allies, which is their starting points right here, start with 38.5 victory points worth of these locations, and the Germans start with 40.5. Now, if at any point in the game, at every turn ends with a victory point calculation phase, and if the Allies or Axis swing this by 10.5 points, so if the Allies get to 49 victory points and the Axis get to 51 victory points, then they immediately win the game and the game's over. And if the game goes all the way to the end of the 6th turn and the Allies haven't won in a previous turn, then the Axis forces win the game, as they are slightly on the defensive as the theater plays out. Let's talk about the characteristics of units, because this is where the game gets really elegant, I think. Now, each unit has its own movement rate. For example, fighters have a movement rate of 4. Sea transports have a movement rate of 3, and we can see these all on the player aid here that shows what the movements are for various units. And as you'd expect, things like battleships, they're pretty slow, whereas heavy bombers here can move 7, so they can cover a lot of ground in the game, as well as air transport can cover quite a bit of ground. So that's one characteristic that the units are distinguished upon. The second characteristic is that all units have an armor rating. And armor ratings are 4 different grades in the game. They're either blue, which is the lightest armor rating, so all of your air units basically have a blue armor rating. So that's a very lightly based unit, a lightly armored unit. The second level of armor is yellow, and then the third level, the hardest level, is red, and very few units, some units can get up to a black level, like the King George battleship, British's special unit, can have a black level of armor. But for the most part, almost all the units are either going to be blue, yellow, or red. So units have a firepower rating as well, and it's distinguished by 3 things. The first way it's distinguished is either blue, yellow, or red, much the same way as armor, and that basically indicates what level of armor it can penetrate, what type of unit it can destroy. So a fighter has a penetration, a firepower of blue, so that means it can only hit, for the most part, it can only hit blue targets. Now, it also has a number expressed on 1 to 12, and I'll show this here on the strip, which is basically its 2-hit number. So if a fighter is in battle, it can hit anything that's got blue armor if it rolls a 7 or higher, as we can see by the number 7 on its rating. But there's a third characteristic of firepower as well, the type of unit it can hit. And so we'll notice if we look at the strip here from the player aid for fighters, it needs a 7 or greater on a die roll of 12. It can hit anything that's got blue armor, but it can only go after air units. So in this game, fighters can't hit land units and they can't go after sea units effectively. So basically the fighters are going to be used to try to take down air transport, light bombers, heavy bombers, or other fighters. But let's take a look, for example, at the tank. The tank here, if we look at the strip on the player aid, has a movement of 3, its armor is yellow, its firepower is yellow, so it's going to roll a yellow die, which means it can hit anything yellow or it can hit anything blue as well. And 1 yellow hit is equal to 2 blue hits, right? So you get the idea how this starts to work. Now, it needs a roll of 7 or greater, but notice, it has a star after it, which means it can only hit land units. So tanks are good. They can't hit air units and they can't hit sea units, as would make sense. They need a roll of 7 and they can hit anything yellow or less. Now, most of the land units here all have yellow armor or blue armor. Infantry are blue, they're lightly armored. Light transports down here, land transports are blue, and then anti-aircraft are blue. Artillery, because of its positioning apparently, is yellow, or perhaps because of a gameplay reason, is yellow, and tanks are yellow. Now, the other thing to consider here too, this is a simple explanation because there are die rolls that can rank up and allow you to hit higher level armor things. You also have a special phase at the end of a turn where you can do concentrated fire, which means that you can combine blue units to hit yellow units and things like that and add them up to kind of upgrade them. And then certain units have die rolls on like a 12 where they do a hit that's of a higher level. So it gets a little bit more complex as you go through it. And this in particular, I think, is where the complexity of the game comes out and where the nuances to gameplay get good. And this is the thing that takes a little while to learn, but as you play it for a little while, it starts to flow really elegantly and you're like, oh, I get it. And you realize that it's kind of like the rock, paper, scissors. Certain units have certain strengths against other units, and how you attack and where you attack and getting the right units to the right places makes all the difference in the world. And so this is kind of a skill that you develop as you play the game a little bit more too. The last thing to know about units as well, in addition to the fact that they have a cost factor for production, which we'll talk about, but they also have a set of special abilities. Those are all listed on the player aid as well. Let's take a look at the Destroyer, for example. Now we can see it's got blue armor. It can hit blue targets, on ocean targets on an 8 or greater. And we'll notice that for special abilities, it has a red arrow in a hexagon. And if we look at the unit abilities, what that means is if you roll a 12, your firepower increases to yellow, which means that you could hit things like cruisers or aircraft carriers, which have a different level of defense. Now, you'll also notice that destroyers have this marker called sonar, and sonar is a special ability that means it may attack and or defend against submarines. So normally, units can't attack submarines because they're under the water, but destroyers are one of those units that have the sonar ability so they can attack. Lastly, it has an escort ability, so it says up to 2 transports may move 4 spaces with a destroyer. So if you have a destroyer as a transport, if a destroyer in a sea-based unit grouping, you can have them move a little bit further if you have destroyer escorts than they could if they were on their own. So those are the special abilities of just a destroyer, and each unit has its own special abilities. And so that again is kind of where this complexity gets in. And it can sound a little bit overwhelming at first because every unit has one of these. It takes about an hour, and then all of a sudden you're like, okay, I got it. And they make sense, so it doesn't really take all that long to learn. I want to talk a little bit about the player aids because these might be, I mentioned the map is one of the most beautiful maps that I've seen in a war game, definitely up there with one of the most elegant maps that I've seen. But the player aids are also worth mentioning as well because as I've started to play the game, I've gone through the rules. There's very little rule diving that I've had to do, and the reason why is that almost all of the information that you need is on these player aids. And basically what we're looking at right now is the back half of the German one, and I want to explain this a little bit because this talks a little bit about the complexity of the game. If I were to give this game a complexity rating, I'm going to give it between a 3 and a 4 out of 10. And the reason why is that you've got a lot of information about each unit, and each unit also has some special abilities. But this is where they're all listed. So if you forget what something is, you can look right here and you can see its attack characteristics, you can see its movement, you can see its ability, what kind of firepower it has and how it works, and you can see its special abilities right here. And on the right-hand side of this one, we see the sequence of play. And I'm going to come back to this one shortly as we do some gameplay. But this basically has almost all of the information that you need in order to be able to execute the game rules. The other side of the sheet is equally helpful. On this one, we have the order of play that we go through and tells like which turns different sides go first in different turns. We have all of the unit abilities that are listed on the other side of this. So if you're wondering what a certain icon is, that +1 in a hexagon, you can look right here. And it says +1 on a roll of a 12, you roll an additional die for attack. Then over here we have the 1942 setup with all of the units and where they go, and the 1943 setup. This is one of the best player aids I've ever seen, and I know in the final version this is going to be a much thicker cardstock. This is a pretty thin cardstock right now. I want to talk a little bit about the sequence of play because the sequence of play is as nuanced and as finely crafted as the units and their special abilities, and it's really this integration of the sequence of play and the units and their abilities that really spawns this dynamic system where it all comes together very elegantly. So let's take a look at the sequence of play and talk about how it works. Now it consists of 2 columns, if you would. On the left-hand side we have the movement steps, on the right-hand side we have the battle steps. And basically what's going to happen is a turn, one side is going to be designated to move first, and that alternates. So if the Germans go first in turn 1, the Allies go first in turn 2, and that can play an impact on how things play out, but that's a different story. But say for the Germans are going to move first in turn 1. That means we go to step 1, and the Germans are going to move all of their fighters and all of their submarines. And then in any locations where combat is generated, you go through all of the battle steps for that location. So if there's combat in a certain sector because of a fighter moving or a submarine moving, you check in that sector and you say, are there any anti-aircraft units? They fire first. Are there any fighters? They go next. Are there any light bombers, heavy bombers? They go next. Submarines, destroyers, then they go. 5 is all of the other sea units. 6 are the land units, and then 7 is a special phase that has concentrated fire. That's where your transports can unload, and then you've got a landing defense if there's kind of a beach landing going on. So each movement and each phase can trigger an entire battle. And that's why these turns take quite a while, because we say that, the 1943 scenario is only 4 turns, but each turn has 6 distinct movement steps that can spawn quite a bit of battles. Now, some of these movement steps are bigger than others. Step number 2, where your sea and your heavy bombers and your air ports move, that's a big one. Step number 3, where all the sea units move, that's where you're going to be launching your sea invasions and things like that. That's a big one. Step number 4 kind of happens down a lot in North Africa, where it's got land units moving around. That's where your land units are going to move and kind of instigate and trigger battles and things like that. And so you can kind of get a sense here for how this all works together in a dynamic system. The other thing to note too is that certain units are going to move a number of times. For example, fighters move in step 1 and step 2, and then they go home, they return in step 6. You have to get them back to a base. So those units are quite active. Destroyers as well. They can move in step 2, they can also move in step 3. Battleships, however, slower, don't move as much. They only move in step 3. So you get a sense here for how, the nature of the unit and the system can work together, and then this sequenced battle step stage creates a lot of different combinations and strategies and tactics to kind of think about and be aware of in order to play the game well. Let's talk a little bit about the national support system, because this is what gives each country its own distinct flavor of units. So as the game starts out, all the units are the same. A battleship for Italy is the same as a battleship for the United States or Britain or Germany, right? So it's got all this kind of flavor that's the same. But then at the end of each turn, you get 2 national support cards and you get 2 national support points, which are basically your currency to buy whatever's on these cards. Now, some of these cards cost 1, 2, I think even 3 national support points. But what that does is it changes often. There's a lot of different elements in here, but one of the things it changes is that it can change the unit. So for example, here for the British, you might get this Matilda 2 tank card. And that means that for the rest of the game, even your existing units and anyone that you build, instead of having yellow armor, they're going to have red armor. And instead of a movement of 3, they're going to have a movement of 2. So they're going to be slow, but they're going to be really hard for your opponent to destroy. So if you get this as Britain, you could say, okay, we're going to spend our 2 national support points for this turn, and we're going to invest in Matilda tanks. And this, in turn, then, could change your entire strategy of the game. Because you could say, as the British, you could go to your American partners and say, okay, we are going to be strong on the land because we're going to have these tanks, so we should take care of perhaps North Africa, and we'll let you perhaps penetrate up into Italy, Sicily, Greece, and things like that and lead our invasion forces because we're going to be really strong on the ground. Let's us come over and handle the Axis presence that's still left in North Africa. So it can dictate entire strategies, and it can make every nation play out in a unique way. So this is one of the favorite things that I like. As you get to the end of a turn, you're like, what kind of goodies am I going to get in these national support cards that are going to allow me to kind of build off and kind of build my country into a unique kind of fighting force. To lean into this a little bit more and explain a little bit in greater depth, for example, the Italians could have this Alpine mountain infantry. Now this actually goes beyond even distinguishing one of your particular infantry units. This is an entire special unit to itself. And for those special units, each nation has one unit that has been crafted as a miniature. The Italians is this Alpine mountain infantry. So when you build these, you get these miniatures. A point on the miniatures, I've heard that in the final version, they're going to be more accurately crafted as representative of the nation's pieces. So these are just kind of, again, prototype pieces that are going to be changed in the final version. The US gets the B-17, the British gets a class of battleship, I think Axis gets the 88s, and then the Italians get the Alpine infantry here. And these are high-level units that can do special things beyond just your own infantry, battleships, anti-aircraft guns, or B-17 bombers. But all units have, you can upgrade, that's different and distinguished, for example, from this upgrade unit, which would upgrade the Italian bomber to a better type of bomber here too. So you get things like that. We could get Soldati class destroyer that's going to give it special abilities. Unrest in Alexandria. Not all of these national support cards are units. Some of them are events or give you special characteristics or special abilities as you go through your turn. So there's a lot of different creativity. And to combine that too with the idea that as you play through these games, each nation has different decks of cards. You might see, in a 5 or 6 turn game, you might see 10 of these cards, and there's probably about, 20 in each nation. So each time you play the game, you're going to have a different package of potential national, if you would, hybridization or national specialization that's going to give you a lot more options, which leans into that whole idea of this is a game that has a tremendous amount of depth, because each time you play, the cards that you're going to get here are going to be different, and you've got 4 nations to play. So a lot of depth in the game that's kind of articulated in how these national support cards work in the game. I want to talk a little bit about the production system in the game. It's very elegant as well. It happens at the end of every turn. And what we're looking at right here now is Alexandria. And basically, if I'm the British forces, I can look at all of the bases and places that I control, and I can see that they each have a production value associated with them. So Alexandria, for example, can produce 20 points worth of land forces. They can produce 22 points worth of sea forces, or 12 points worth of air forces. Now, you can only produce one of each type in a place at the end of a turn. So if we were going to use Alexandria for production, we'd have to pick one of these 3 things, and we'd have to do the other 2 production items in different bases that we own. So for example, a good choice here would be building 22 points worth of naval forces in Alexandria, assuming we control it as the British, at the end of a turn. And then basically, each unit in the game has a cost associated with it. I can show you on the chart right here. So sea transports are 1, submarines are 3, destroyers are 3, cruisers 6, aircraft carriers 7, and battleships, the big ones, are 12 to produce. And basically, you spend those amounts and those units show up here in that city, or if they're ships, they show up right off the city there, and you bring them into the game at the end of that turn. So it's a very quick and elegant production system that works to kind of keep bringing forces into your game, because you are going to lose a lot of forces in combat. It's just, this stuff gets lost, right? The other thing I will say is that certain of the national support cards can influence production, and there is a strategic bombing element that you can perform in the game to reduce the production in cities as well. So there's a number of ways that this number might change, but that's the general system of how production works in the game. I want to talk a little bit about hidden fleets, because this is a cool mechanic in multiplayer play that can really make a big swing in the game. So in the 1943 scenario, for example, both Germany and the United States start with a hidden fleet. And the United States hidden fleet is rather substantial. It contains all of the units that we're looking at here: battleship, cruiser, aircraft carrier, destroyer, 2 tanks, 2 units of infantry, some sea transport. So this is basically a naval landing force that starts the game with, and some air cover, and then some artillery. So this is a substantial invasion force you've got here, and it can start in one of 3 squares in the Mediterranean that the Germans and the Axis forces don't know. And what you do at the beginning of the game to designate its location, you use this wheel to pick the letter of the zone and the number of the zone. So let's take a look at those 3 starting locations where we could place this as the US. Now, the US starting options for that hidden fleet are F7, which lies just to the south of Sicily. We could also do it in G3, which lies a little bit farther to the south and just southwest of Malta, or H6, which is right to the south of Malta. Now, it moves at the speed of its slowest unit, which is sea transport battleships. They all have a movement of 3 zones. And you might think, well, that's not very far, but this gives you an idea a little bit of the dynamic nature of the game. Because if you want to place that hidden fleet, for example, in F7, you can move it 3 zones per turn. You can go 1, 2, 3 basically up here, which puts you very close to the boot of Italy. So you can imagine in your second turn, you can conceivably execute a naval landing in Italy if you would like, or you could go right into Sicily if you want. You can even in 3 turns perhaps slide it over to Greece if you want. Now there are ways, what makes it cool, certain units can detect that hidden fleet. You could go into a zone and say, okay, I'm going to search in this zone for the hidden fleet, and if it's there, then you've found it, and that helps a lot. But if you're playing as the Axis forces, you've got this massive US fleet that you don't know where it's going to show up until you can either find it or until it declares where it is, and then it creates the problem for the Axis forces. So it's a really cool mechanic that exists in the game, in those multiplayer games. And this is the only mechanic, again, that I think doesn't work very well, as a solo player. Now there are options as well. At certain points in the turn, you can spawn a hidden fleet, you can remove some units from the board, and that becomes a hidden fleet. And so you can kind of rebuild these as the game goes on as well. Let's wrap this up and put a bow on it. So this was one of my favorite games of 2022, unequivocally very high on the list of my favorite games from last year. It's a type of game that as soon as you finish, you want to play again. It's also the type of game that as you do that, you're like, oh, if I did this, it might happen differently. You think of all the different options and ideas you could have done. And then when you fold into that, the fact that the next game you play, even if you play the same country, you might get different national support options. You'd be like, oh, it'd be really cool if I get the Germans and maybe I get Tiger tanks or Stuka bombers. And then, oh, maybe if I'm the US, I got B-17 bombers. Or what if I got Matilda tanks as the British? Because those unique units can change your points of emphasis and change your strategy. And you've got 4 different nations to play. Each one of the nations has different advantages and different positional situations, different unique units. So there is just so much to explore playing all of these nations and playing this package. Tremendously fun to play with a group of people. It's very good solitaire as well. I can't recommend this game more highly. I am super excited to see it come to Kickstarter, and yeah, big thumbs up for me.